As always, thank you, Steve. It's a good reminder of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We're still going through our sermon series on Jesus is Lord. And today we're going to be looking, the title I gave this is He is More Than a Man, even though that's all that Pilate said. It is Easter Sunday, that day when we respond to anyone who says He is risen with the resounding, He is risen indeed. But before we continue our annual celebration of the day when Jesus rose from the dead, we're going to sort of back up in the story to that moment when Jesus was standing before Pilate, being interrogated by him. Pilate was, I'm sure you recall, that infamous governor of ancient Judea, put there in place by Rome. He was questioning Jesus because the Jewish leaders, who had already made up their minds about Jesus and his identity, had brought him before Pilate, but they wouldn't enter into the praetorium, which is where Pilate lived at and had space at and made all of his judgments at. They didn't go in because the scriptures tell us that they didn't want to defile themselves by going into that space, by doing something that was against their own regulations, which would then make them ritually unclean and would have prevented them from observing the Passover, which is why everyone was in Jerusalem. It is the kind of legalistic hypocrisy that Jesus had been pointing out all during his ministry. Upon seeing Jesus in their midst, Pilate asked them, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They claimed that Jesus was an evildoer. I don't know that this accusation sounds all that bad today, an evildoer. But the word back then that they used meant that Jesus had deliberately done what was prohibited by their understanding of the laws. And he had repeatedly been warned to stop, but he continued to do it. And because he continued, he deserved to be punished for his crimes. But they did not, I'm sure you noticed, accuse Jesus of being a murderer or a thief or even someone who tried to cause subversion. But you probably didn't know that both a robber and a thief are along the accusations with evildoer that were often made of those who were part of the early church. In response to these kinds of accusation, it was Peter who said in his first letter that it was one thing to be accused of doing such things and quite another to be guilty of actually doing them. Peter went on to say that if those in the emerging church kept doing what was right according to Jesus' teachings and suffered for it because they were falsely accused of doing evil, then it would be to their glory. But if they were guilty as charged, then their suffering would be justified. He concluded that if you are going to suffer in this life, it's better to suffer from being falsely accused. It is better, he said, because that's exactly what happened to Jesus. Not everyone who follows Jesus is going to suffer for it. Some will be praised for the good things that they do, but some, like Jesus, are going to be falsely accused of doing evil. And they're going to suffer at the hands of those who really are the evil ones. There is a part of us that recognizes that this is an injustice. And that part of us wants to stand up and fight for what is right. Like Peter did whenever he took the sword from one of those who came with Judas to arrest Jesus. Peter thought that he was standing up and defending Jesus, doing what was right whenever he slashed off the ear of the man with that sword. But Jesus saw it otherwise. What Peter did was wrong. He took the sword away from Peter, and he restored the ear to the man who was wounded, and he accepted the unjust suffering that would lead to his death. What Jesus did goes against our very nature. We want to stand up and fight against injustice. It didn't make it into any of the movie versions of that very popular Easter movie, Ben-Hur. But it did in the book on which those movies were based on. If you haven't read the book Ben-Hur, I encourage you to do so. In the book, Ben-Hur, a fictional character, saw Jesus being led to the cross. He was by that time in the book's storyline already a believer. Some other believers encouraged Ben to join them in this effort to jump in and save Jesus from what was happening before their eyes as he went down that famed Via Dolorosa. But Ben declines because in the story, Jesus had already told him whenever he was preaching to his disciples and Peter that his unjust suffering was a part of God's plan to bring freedom to everyone who was a slave to sin. That part really is in the Bible. Peter had heard that before he picked up the sword. He just didn't understand what Jesus was saying whenever you make Jesus the Lord of your life. You see, Pilate was caught up in God's plan, even though he didn't realize it. Pilate immediately recognized that the Jewish leaders' accusation against Jesus was not about breaking a Roman law, but about Jewish ones. And so Pilate told these leaders, you just go and judge Jesus according to your own laws. It seems that Pilate didn't know at that time that they had already judged Jesus during the night at several impromptu trials. And because they had already done what Pilate was now asking them to do, they complained. They said, well, we're not permitted to carry out our judgment on him. We're not permitted to put anyone to death. And that's what we believe Jesus deserves. While some crimes are worthy of being punished by death, even today, no one would ever want someone who was falsely accused to suffer such a fate. And since some people who are falsely accused can't end up facing the death penalty, it is often argued that we should do away with the death penalty altogether, lest an innocent person be punished for a guilty person's crime in an irreversible way by mistake. But what Jesus was doing was no mistake. The Jewish leaders' authority to invoke the death penalty had been taken away from them because Rome's leaders felt that it was used to punish people for crimes that, well, Rome didn't see worthy of death. I don't know if you knew, but in ancient Rome, they only invoked the death penalty for citizens who had committed treason, murder, robbery, or arson. And Jesus wasn't being accused of any of those. Now, non-citizens in Rome could also be put to death for adultery, rape, and counterfeiting. But Jesus wasn't being accused of that either. Beyond that, well, other penalties were felt sufficient in Rome. However, if you've ever read the Old Testament, then you probably know that it calls for a lot of other sins to be punished by death. And the Jewish leaders often enacted the death penalty for them when it suited their purposes. Rome felt that they were doing the Jewish people a favor by preventing their leaders from invoking the death penalty when it shouldn't be invoked. And now here are those same leaders insisting that Jesus be put to death for being an evildoer, not on Rome's list. The likelihood that this request was unjust compelled Pilate to take Jesus into the praetorium and examine Jesus for himself, trying to determine if Jesus had committed a crime worthy of death according to Rome, like treason. And so Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" A treasonous question. Jesus did not answer his question, but instead asked Pilate what inspired his question. Was he really interested in Jesus' true identity, or was it a question based on some other motive? Pilate was not interested in learning about Jesus' identity, only whether he broke a Roman law or not. And so, interestingly enough, Pilate tells Jesus the truth. Well, I'm not a Jew. Why would I be concerned? And then Pilate reminded Jesus that it was his own nation and his own chief priest who had delivered Jesus into Pilate's own hands. Trying to evaluate the accusation against Jesus, Pilate asked, "What have you done?" And Jesus confessed. He had come to establish a kingdom. But it was not a kingdom of this world. If it had been of this world, Jesus' followers would take up arms. They would have prevented him from being captured by the Jews. But as it is, his kingdom is not of this realm. From which Pilate surmised, bringing him to ask, "So you are a king?" And Jesus affirmed, yes, he was a king. It is why he had been born, and it is why he had come to the world. He had come very specifically to bear witness to the truth about himself, a truth that would set men free and establish his kingdom. And Jesus told Pilate, "Those who are of the truth will recognize my voice," implying that they would also then become the ones that Jesus would comprise his kingdom of. Pilate was obviously not among those who recognized Jesus' voice, because Pilate asked him, and it seems from frustration, "What's truth?" Jesus could have said, "I am the truth and the way and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me," which he had done on other occasions, but he did not. Pilate went back out to the Jewish leaders and those now gathered along with them, and he gave his judgment about Jesus, the man. "I find no guilt in him." That is, Pilate did not consider what Jesus confessed to was worthy of the death penalty. Hoping to bring an end to the Jewish leaders' desire to enact an injustice, Pilate gave those gathered a choice, which would sort of get them out of their quandary, a choice between prisoners, which he would release in keeping with a Passover custom. But to his surprise, they did not want the king of the Jews released, but a robber named Barabbas, a thief. He had broken Roman law. He did deserve to die. Now, if you didn't know, Barabbas, or Barabbas, his first name was also Jesus, we find in the Gospels. So Pilate was really asking this crowd, "Which Jesus do you want?" The Jewish leaders would later let slip that one of the evil things that Jesus had done was claim to be the Son of God. So Pilate was really asking them, "Who do you want? Jesus, the Son of God? Or do you want Jesus, the Son of the Father?" Which is what Barabbas, son of the Father, meant. Their choice of Barabbas actually advanced God's plan to save the world through the sacrifice of his one and only Son, who would take the sins of the world to the cross and rise victoriously over an unjust death on the third day. The text we read earlier in our worship service is what happened next. It recalled how Pilate had Jesus flogged, after which the soldiers carried out Pilate's order and twisted together a crown of thorns and jammed it on his head. They also put on a purple robe on Jesus, and they came up to him mockingly saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," as they slapped him in the face. It was after watching Jesus suffer that ridicule that Pilate went back out to the crowd who had gathered at his gate, waiting for his final judgment. And Pilate told them again, "I find no guilt in him." And then he brings out the spectacle, wearing the crown of thorns. And Pilate says, "Behold the man." And the chief priest and the crowd yells, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate told them, "You take him, and you crucify yourselves, because I find no guilt in him." This is when the chief priests slipped up and said that Jesus deserved to die in their estimation, because he claimed to be the Son of God. Pilate, on hearing this, grew afraid, and he took Jesus back inside and asked him, "Jesus, where are you from?" Now he's sort of interested in Jesus' identity. But Jesus remains silent, as Isaiah prophesied. Pilate reminded Jesus that he had the authority to turn him loose and let him live, or to have him die. And Jesus told Pilate that he only had that authority because Jesus' Father in heaven had given it to him. Pilate, it says, made every effort to release Jesus. But the Jewish leaders would have none of it. They kept reminding Pilate that if he were to release Jesus, that he, Pilate himself, was no friend to Caesar. For everyone who makes himself out to be a king, as Jesus was, opposes Caesar. Sort of interesting that Pilate actually understood Jesus' identity than even those Jewish leaders. You know, there are a lot of people today who agree with Pilate. They don't think that Jesus was anything more than a man either. And they recognize that what happened to Jesus was unjust. And had they been there, they would have tried to help Pilate find a way to release Jesus. They would have stood up against injustice in any form it presents itself. But they would have failed too, because Jesus' unjust suffering for sin really was God's plan. John notes in his description that this was the day of preparation for Passover. It was the day when the lambs would be killed and their blood would be smeared on the doorposts of each home and each house and wherever they were celebrating. They would remember that day when their ancestors had done the same, and how the death angel would pass over their homes because of the blood on the post. They did not deserve to be spared, but they were covered by this innocent blood. The death angel would enter into the houses without the blood of the innocent lambs, and it would take the life of their firstborn son. A tragedy that would compel Pharaoh to set Israel free. One son, much less a nation of sons, is too many. But the death angel will come to those who are unprepared. But instead of taking them, it is God's one and only Son who has died in the place of every son and every daughter. For we are all under the penalty of sin, which is death. Like Barabbas, we know we deserve to die. But Jesus takes our place, and we go free. He really is the Lamb of God who came to take away the sin of the world, dying not only for us, but for the entire world. When Pilate presented Jesus to the crowd as the King of the Jews, you know what they said? You remember? They said, "We have no king but Caesar." Which brings the question, what about you? Who is the king of your life? Have you chosen Jesus, the Lamb of God, or is something else really the master of your life? Jesus said that you can't serve two masters. You'll love one, you'll hate the other. Jesus was crucified. He died on the cross as a sacrifice for your sin. And 3 days later, just as he proclaimed in advance, according to God's great plan, Jesus rose from the dead. He was the first to rise, but he won't be the last. All who hear his voice calling them to follow and who recognize it as God's Son come to save themselves will be drawn to Jesus, and they will follow him into eternity. That is why we celebrate Jesus' resurrection. It gives us hope that allows us to face every uncertainty, every loss, every sorrow, every disease, every injustice, because we know that such things, even if they lead to death, are only temporary. For one day we will follow Jesus into that place where there are no sorrows And there are no more tears because the penalty for sin has been paid and there's no place for it there. For me, I have no other Lord, no other Master, no other King, but Jesus, the Son of God. And I long for that day when I will follow him in that place that he has prepared for those who make him the Lord of their lives. We have come to celebrate. That's what we're here for. It's time to celebrate because he has risen, right?
He is risen.
And one day, so will we. We have a hymn of invitation. And I hope that you hear Jesus' voice calling you. And you respond to it, that you might rise with him when that time comes. Would you please stand?